The newspapers arrived at Balmoral the way they always did, folded, ironed by somebody whose job that was, laid out on a side table in a room where the fires were lit, even in August, because the walls of that castle hold cold the way stone does everywhere. It was the 20th of August 1992. Sarah Ferguson was staying there with her two small daughters. She was, at that point, still legally the Duchess of York, separated from her husband for 5 months, and still expected to appear at breakfast. She came down. The papers were there. On the front of the Daily Mirror were photographs taken on a terrace in the south of France, and in them she was topless, and a man who was not her husband was holding her foot to his mouth. What happened over the next several hours has been described by her, and described by people who were in the house, and described by biographers working from both, and the versions differ in the small ways that all such versions differ. Nobody disputes the essentials. She was in a room full of the most powerful family in the country. The photographs were on the table. Nobody screamed. Nobody threw anything. The Queen said something to her privately, and the substance of it was that she should go. Prince Philip, by the accounts that exist, did not address her again for years. She packed. She drove herself to Aberdeen. Her daughters, aged 4 and 2, went with her. That is the scene everyone remembers. It runs on every retrospective. It opens every documentary. It is the still image the archive uses when her name comes up. And it is the wrong place to start, because by the time those photographs were printed, the decision about Sarah Ferguson had already been taken. It had been taken years earlier, by people who never appeared in a photograph, in a process that left almost no paper. The pictures did not end her position inside the royal family. They confirmed an ending that was already most of the way through. Before I go further, if you are the kind of person who watches these all the way down, hit the like button and subscribe, because that genuinely helps this channel more than anything else. And tell me in the comments where you are watching from. I read them. The thing she had that almost nobody else had was the vantage point. She was inside the family for 10 years, married to the son the Queen was widely understood to be fondest of, living in the palace, and then in a house built for her on Crown land, and she was also, from the beginning, treated as provisional. She was the outsider who got close enough to see the mechanism working, and was never quite trusted enough to be protected by it. She watched what the institution does to a person it has decided is a liability. She watched it do that to her while it was still doing it politely, and she watched it do that a full generation before the same machinery was pointed at her husband. That is the reason this story is worth 2.5 hours. Not because the photographs on the terrace were shocking, and not because a marriage in a famous family ended badly, which is common enough. It is worth the time because Sarah Ferguson is the only person alive who has been on both sides of the same institutional decision. She was the problem the palace managed in 1992. 27 years later, she was standing next to the man the palace had to manage in 2019, and she could see exactly which levers were being pulled, in what order, by whom, because they had all been pulled on her. She had already seen the cruelty. She saw it long before the scandal broke. I want to be precise about what I mean by cruelty, because it is a word that gets used loosely in royal stories, and it usually means somebody was rude at a dinner. That is not what this is. The British monarchy in the second half of the 20th century operated a system for protecting itself that had 4 working parts, and none of the 4 required anybody to raise their voice. The first part is that the institution does not defend you. It does not attack you either. It simply stops issuing the statements that would have made the attacks stop. In a media environment where a palace denial can kill a story in one news cycle, choosing not to deny is a decision with consequences, and it is a decision that leaves no fingerprints. There is no memo saying we withdrew protection from the Duchess of York. There is only the absence of the thing that would have protected her. The second part is the anonymous quote. Somebody described in print as a senior royal source, or a courtier close to the Queen, or a friend of the family, says something wounding to a newspaper, and it runs. And the palace press office is not obliged to confirm or deny anything, because officially nobody said it. This was not a theory about how the palace worked. In March 1992, it stopped being a theory, and I will come back to that in detail, because it is the single best documented moment of institutional briefing against a member of the royal family in the modern era, and the man who did it apologized for it in writing. The third part is money. Members of that family who are born into it have income streams that do not depend on their popularity. Members who marry into it have whatever they are given. Sarah Ferguson came into the marriage with a secretarial training and a job in publishing, gave up the job because that was what was expected, and came out of the marriage 10 years later with a settlement that was not designed to sustain a woman who would be photographed everywhere she went for the rest of her life. What she did next, and the trouble she got into doing it, is inseparable from that arithmetic. It does not excuse the worst of it. It explains the shape of it. The fourth part is time. The institution is not in a hurry. It can wait out a bad headline, a bad year, a bad decade. It can let somebody sit outside the tent for 25 years and then invite them to one funeral, and the invitation will be reported as a warm reconciliation. Individuals cannot operate on that timescale. Institutions can. That asymmetry is where most of the damage happens. Put those four together and you get something that is genuinely cruel and never looks cruel from the outside, which is the point. There is no villain to name, and no moment at which the family did the terrible thing. What there is instead is a woman who was loved by the whole country in July 1986, and who by 1996 was in debt, out of the family, stripped of her style, uninvited from the funerals of people she had known well, and widely understood by the British public that have deserved every bit of it. Some of it she did deserve. I am not going to spend 2.5 hours arguing that Sarah Ferguson was an innocent, because she was not. She spent money she did not have with a persistence that went well past carelessness. She trusted people who were obviously selling her. She sat in a hotel suite in London in 2010 and offered a stranger access to her former husband for £500,000, on camera, and there is no version of that story where she is the wronged party. She took money from Jeffrey Epstein in 2011, when what Epstein was had already been established in an American courtroom, and then called it an error of judgment, which it was, and which does not begin to cover it. All of that is real, and all of it is in this account, and I have not softened any of it. But there is a question underneath the catalogue of her failures that almost nobody asks, and it is the question this whole video is built around. She arrived at that family at 26 years old, with no training, no staff of her own worth the name, no income of her own, no guidance, and a husband who was at sea for most of the year. She arrived as the most popular royal bride in living memory. The press adored her because she laughed with her mouth open and rode badly and made jokes at her own expense, and the public adored her for the same reasons, and the reasons the public adored her in 1986 are word for word the reasons the same newspapers destroyed her in 1989. Nobody in that household sat her down and explained what she had walked into. She has said this repeatedly, across 4 decades, in interviews and in 2 memoirs, and the striking thing is that nobody from inside the institution has ever really contradicted it. There was no induction, there was no job. What existed instead was a diary secretary, a great deal of empty time, and an expectation that she would work out the rules by breaking them. She broke them, she kept breaking them, and every time she broke one, the machinery took a small step back, and by the time she looked up there was nobody standing behind her at all. So this is going to be the account of a woman who saw the thing working from the inside, at close range, while it was working on her, and who has spent the 30 years since living in the strange position of being the only witness who is both credible and permanently discredited. Everything she says about the palace is true, and no one has to believe her, because of what she did. That is not an accident. It is close to being the design. We are going to start in a Hampshire farmhouse in the 1960s, with a father who was a professional at proximity to royalty, and a mother who walked out, because the pattern that governs the rest of her life is set before she is 13. Then the Ascot house party in 1985, where Diana put her next to Andrew on purpose. Then the wedding, and it is genuinely worth remembering how enormous the goodwill was, because the collapse only makes sense against the height it fell from. Then 1987, the year everything turned, and it turned over something as stupid as a television game show in a field at Alton Towers. After that come the nicknames, and the campaign about her weight, and the helicopter book with the plagiarism row attached to it, and the holidays counted in column inches, and the slow assembly of a public character called Fergie, who was made of things Sarah Ferguson actually did, and who was not, in any complete sense, her. Then 1992, which was the worst year the House of Windsor had had since the abdication, and which contained, in 8 months, a set of photographs found in a flat in Cadogan Square, a separation announced from Buckingham Palace, a briefing to the BBC that the Queen's own press secretary had to apologise for in writing, a topless photograph on a terrace, a taped telephone call between the Princess of Wales and a man who called her Squidgy, and a fire that burned through 100 rooms of Windsor Castle in November. The Queen called it a horrible year in Latin at the Guildhall, and the phrase went round the world. She was not exaggerating. Then the divorce, and the loss of the style Her Royal Highness, which sounds like a technicality, and is not, because it changed who had to bow to whom, in a family where that is the whole language. Then the 25 years that followed, which are the part nobody covers properly, and which are, for my money, the most revealing part of the entire story. The debts, the American Diet Company, the children's books, the Turkish carpet business, and the string of ventures that went wrong, the hotel suite in 2010, with a reporter and a bag of cash. And, running under all of it, the arrangement that everybody in Britain found funny, and that I think is the saddest single fact in this account, which is that she went on living in the same house as the man she had divorced, for more than 2 decades, because neither of them could quite manage the alternative. And then the scandal. The one the title of this video is pointing at. Because when Jeffrey Epstein finally became a name the palace could not survive being connected to, the machinery came out again, in the same order, with the same moving parts. The withdrawal of protection, the unattributed briefing, the financial squeeze, the waiting. Sarah Ferguson watched that happen to Prince Andrew from inside the same house. She knew what each move meant before it landed, because every one of them had been used on her first, and by then she was tangled in the same scandal herself, from a different angle, in a way that made it impossible for her to say any of it out loud. That is where we are going. Stay with me, because the middle of this, the years between 1996 and 2010, is where almost every documentary about this woman goes quiet, and it is exactly where the interesting material is. There is one more thing to establish before we go back to the beginning, and it concerns the title of this video, so I want to deal with it honestly, rather than let it sit there. Andrew married once. Sarah Ferguson is his first wife, and his only wife, and there was never a second one, and if you came here expecting a hidden earlier marriage, there is not one. What there is, and what the phrase is pointing at, is a woman who occupied the position of Andrew's wife during the decade before any of the conduct that eventually undid him became public, and who was therefore in the room for the formative version of him. The man who sat down with Emily Maitlis in 2019 and could not produce a single ordinary human sentence about the situation he was in did not become that man overnight. He was assembled slowly, by a mother who indulged him, by a grandmother who thought he was the best of the lot, by a navy that gave him one authentic achievement in 1982, and by 30 years of a household reorganizing itself around him. Sarah married him at the peak of him. She was there for the assembly. So when I say she saw the cruelty up close, I mean 2 separate things, and they run in parallel through everything that follows. She saw what the institution does to an outsider it has finished with. And she saw, at close range and over 10 years of marriage, what the institution does to an insider it never says no to, which turns out to be its own kind of damage, and which took longer to become visible and cost other people a great deal more. Now, Hampshire, 1959. She was born on the 15th of October, 1959, in London, and grew up at Dummerdown House, a farm in Hampshire that had been in the family a long time and looked, in photographs from the period, like every English childhood in every English novel. Fields, ponies, a working farm with a house attached rather than a house with a farm attached. Her older sister Jane, dogs everywhere. Her father was Major Ronald Ferguson, and his profession is the single most important fact in her early life, because it was proximity. Ronald Ferguson played polo and then managed polo, and he managed it for Prince Philip and later for Prince Charles. He was the Guards Polo Club man, the one who organized the ponies and the fixtures and the players, the person who stood at the edge of the ground with the royal family in the middle distance, and knew everybody's name. That is a specific kind of English position, and it is worth being precise about it. He was not an aristocrat. The Fergusons were landed and comfortable and utterly respectable, and there was no title, and there was not the sort of money that insulates a family from anything. What Ronald Ferguson had was access. He was in the tent. He was useful to the people in the tent. His whole social existence was built on being close to a family he was not a member of, and being valued for a competence they needed. His daughter absorbed that arrangement before she could have described it. Proximity to royalty was not exotic in the Ferguson house. It was the family business. Sarah grew up around the Windsors as a normal condition of life, running about at polo grounds, and the boy she eventually married was a boy she had met in a paddock somewhere in childhood, the way you meet the children of your father's colleagues. The other central fact of her childhood is her mother. Susan Ferguson left in 1972. She had met an Argentine polo player named Hector Barrantes, and she went, and eventually she married him and moved to Argentina and lived on a ranch several thousand miles from Hampshire. Sarah was 12, Jane was 16, and would herself go to Australia a few years later. Sarah has written about this and talked about it in ways that make it clear she does not consider it settled even now. Her mother did not abandon her in the tabloid sense. There were visits and letters and a relationship that continued, and Sarah later described Hector Barrantes with real warmth. But a 12-year-old girl in a farmhouse in Hampshire, whose mother is now living in South America, is a 12-year-old girl running a house for her father, and that is what she did. She has said the phrase "looking after dad" about that period more than once. She has also said, in more than one interview, that she spent the rest of her life terrified of being left, and that she would do very nearly anything to keep a room warm and a person pleased. You can accept that as self-diagnosis, and still notice how well it predicts the next 50 years. She cannot tolerate disapproval. She befriends whoever in the room is being charming to her, without ever checking what they want in return. She says yes. The schooling was ordinary for her class. Danshill, then Hurst Lodge at Sunningdale, where she was a boarder, and was remembered as noisy and popular and not academic, which is the standard verdict on almost every English girl who is later famous, so take it lightly. She did not go to university, she went to Secretarial College, which was still, in the late 1970s, the recognized route for a girl of that background into a job that would be respectable and temporary and would end with marriage. Then she worked. This part gets skated over, and it should not be, because she is one of the very few people who has married into that family having held an actual job for an actual salary for several years. She worked in public relations, then for an art gallery, then in publishing at a small firm, doing acquisition and editorial work, and by the accounts of people who worked with her, she was good at the human parts of it and shambolic at the administrative parts, which will not surprise anybody who follows the rest of this story. She traveled, she lived a bit in Europe, and through most of her early 20s she was involved with a man called Paddy McNally, who was significantly older than her, a widower with 2 sons, based in Switzerland, and heavily involved in the commercial side of Formula One. It went on for around 3 years. He was, by every account including hers, not going to marry her. That is the woman Diana Spencer put next to Prince Andrew at a house party at Windsor Castle during Royal Ascot in June 1985. 25 years old, unmarried, working for a living, funny, loud, red-haired, recently out of a long relationship that had gone nowhere, daughter of a man the family had known for decades, entirely at ease around royalty, and entirely without standing of her own. Diana had known her for years. They were distantly related, 4th cousins, and had moved in overlapping circles since childhood. And Diana, 4 years into her own marriage, and by 1985, already deeply unhappy inside it, wanted an ally. That motive matters. The friendship between those 2 women, which starts here, and which is genuine and warm and lasts, with one long interruption, until Diana's death, is one of the load-bearing relationships of this whole story, and it begins with an isolated young woman recruiting somebody who would make the family less lonely. They sat next to each other at lunch. Andrew was 25. He had been back from the Falklands 3 years, where he had flown Sea King helicopters off HMS Invincible during the war in 1982, including duty as a decoy for Exocet missiles, and had come home to the sort of national approval that a young prince gets exactly once. He was, in that period, genuinely something. Handsome in a way that the photographs still carry. A serving officer with a real war behind him. The tabloids had spent the early 80s calling him Randy Andy and running his girlfriends on the front page, and the country found all of it delightful, because a young man behaving that way is delightful when he is 22 and has flown into gunfire. She teased him. He liked it. By all accounts, including both of theirs, the thing that made it work immediately was that she treated him like a person at a lunch rather than the Queen's son, and he had almost no experience of that outside the Navy. The courtship ran through the second half of 1985, and the winter that followed, conducted with the sort of secrecy that was still just about possible then and would be impossible now. Balmoral, Sandringham, weekends. The press got hold of it, because they always did, and by the new year, the story was running, and the tone of it was uniformly delighted. He proposed in February. The engagement was announced on the 19th of March, 1986, and the ring was a Burmese ruby, surrounded by 10-drop diamonds, that he had a hand in designing, chosen partly because the red was near enough her hair, and the country lost its mind. I want to hold here for a moment, because the volume of goodwill in the spring and summer of 1986 is genuinely difficult to convey now, after everything, and if you do not feel it, you will not understand what followed. Diana had been on the throne of public affection for 5 years, and had turned out to be, in public, rather shy and rather fragile, and very hard to photograph laughing. Sarah Ferguson was the opposite in every direction. She was not beautiful in the fashion plate way, and nobody pretended otherwise, including her. She was tall and solid, and she rode, and she skied, and she laughed at volume, and when she stood on a balcony, she looked like she was enjoying herself. The papers called her a breath of fresh air, and they meant it, and for a period of roughly 2 years, it was almost impossible to find a negative word about her anywhere in the British press. The wedding was on the 23rd of July, 1986, at Westminster Abbey. The dress had a 17-foot train with bees and thistles worked into it, bees for the Ferguson arms, and her initial and his worked into the beading, and she walked up that aisle in front of a global television audience that was estimated at somewhere around 500 million people, and the estimate is soft, as all such estimates are, but the order of magnitude is right. They were created Duke and Duchess of York that morning. It is one of the great titles of the British royal family, and it carries a specific history, which is that it goes to the second son, and that the last 2 men to hold it were a king who never expected to be one, and his father before him. It is the title of the spare. And then the crowd went home, and the cameras went away, and the new Duchess of York was left standing in a building she did not know how to live in, married to a man whose employer was the Royal Navy, and who would be gone for most of the next 5 years, with nothing in her diary, no salary, no training, and no idea at all what the job was. That is where the trouble starts, not on a terrace in France 6 years later, in a set of rooms at Buckingham Palace, in the autumn of 1986, with a 27-year-old woman who had been in employment 3 months earlier, waiting for somebody to tell her what she was supposed to do all day. Nobody ever did. There is a thing people assume about marrying into the British royal family, which is that there is a system, a program, somebody senior who takes you through the constitutional position, the charities, the precedents, the forms of address, what you say to the press and what you never say, how the money works, who you can trust in the household, and who reports to whom. Something like an induction. There was no such thing. There is still, by most accounts, no such thing, which is why every woman who has married into that family in the last 60 years has described the same experience in almost identical language. Diana described it. Sarah described it. Meghan Markle described it in 2021 and was widely disbelieved. And the interesting thing about her account is how closely it matches an account given by a woman who married the same family 35 years earlier and who had every establishment credential Meghan lacked. Sarah Ferguson was given rooms at Buckingham Palace. She was given a lady-in-waiting and eventually the use of a private secretary. She was given a diary that had almost nothing in it, because the engagements that fill a senior royal diary come from patronages, and patronages are allocated slowly, and nobody was in a hurry to allocate them to a new duchess whose husband was a serving naval officer and who might be posted anywhere. And she was given a husband who was not there. The absence is the part that gets underplayed in every account of this marriage, and it is close to being the whole story of the first 5 years. Andrew was a professional naval officer, not a prince playing at one. He was at sea. He served on HMS Brazen and later commanded HMS Cottesmore, and the deployments were real deployments. And in the early years of their marriage, the couple worked out that they had spent something in the region of 40 days together in a 12-month period. She said that figure publicly. Nobody in the household ever produced a different one. So the picture in 1987 and 1988 is a woman in her late 20s, married 3 months, living in a palace, with a husband at sea, no job, no salary, no fixed duties, and a public appetite for her that was, at that moment, effectively infinite. Anything she did was photographed. Nothing she did was scheduled. That combination is a trap, and it does not require anybody to be malicious for it to close. What she did with the time was travel, and ski, and shop, and take flying lessons, which she paid for herself, and at which she was actually rather good, and turn up at things. And every one of those activities cost money that she did not personally have, and was recorded by photographers who were by then following her permanently, and was totted up by newspapers into a running account of what this woman was costing the country. That account was not accurate. Much of what she was doing was privately funded, or funded by Andrew, or funded by people who wanted her at their resort. The accuracy was not the point. The arithmetic made a good headline, and no one at the palace ever corrected it. And I want you to notice that this is the first appearance of the first of the 4 moving parts. Nobody attacked her, they simply did not defend her, and a false number that goes uncorrected for 6 months becomes a true fact about a person. Beatrice was born on the 8th of August 1988, and Eugenie on the 23rd of March 1990. There is nothing in the record from anybody, hostile or friendly, that suggests she was anything other than a devoted mother, and that consistency across 4 decades of otherwise brutal coverage is worth registering. Even the journalists who took her apart on everything else left the children alone, mostly because there was nothing there to take. But the year that matters, the year the temperature changed, is 1987, and it changed over something so trivial that it is genuinely difficult to explain to anybody who was not in Britain at the time. On the 15th of June 1987, a television program called The Grand Knockout Tournament was broadcast on the BBC. Prince Edward had come up with it. The format was a celebrity version of a long-running slapstick game show in which people in enormous foam costumes fell over in water while a commentator shouted. The royal participants were Edward, Anne, Andrew and Sarah, each captaining a team of celebrities in medieval fancy dress in a field at Alton Towers for charity. It raised well over £1 million. It was a catastrophe. Not on the night. The audience was huge. The disaster was in the register. For 50 years, the family's entire public method had been built on a single principle, which is that they are seen constantly and known never. They appear, they are gracious, they say almost nothing, and the dignity is maintained by the distance. On that afternoon in Staffordshire, 4 of them stood in a field in costume, shouting, being sprayed with water, visibly competitive, visibly enjoying it, entirely ordinary. Sarah Ferguson threw herself into it harder than any of them, because throwing herself into things was the quality everybody had been applauding for a year. The press verdict was savage, and it was almost unanimous, and Edward made it worse by walking into the press conference afterwards, asking the assembled journalists what they thought, receiving silence, and walking out again. What the papers wrote, in various forms, was that the royal family had demeaned itself. That is the moment the license was withdrawn. Before Alton Towers, the informality of the Duchess of York was charming and modern, and a sign that the monarchy was moving with the times. After it, the same informality was vulgarity. Not one thing about her behavior changed. The frame around the behavior changed, and once a frame like that turns over, it does not turn back. What followed over the next 2 years was a press campaign of a kind that is hard to imagine now, and to understand it, you have to understand what Fleet Street was in the late 1980s, because Sarah Ferguson did not walk into a media environment. she walked into a war. British national newspapers in that period were fighting for circulation on a scale that no longer exists. The Sun under Kelvin Mackenzie was selling around 4 million copies a day, and the Mirror was chasing it, and the Star was chasing both, and the mid-market titles were fighting a separate war underneath, and the whole business was operating in the years immediately after the move to Wapping had broken the print unions and slashed the cost of producing a paper. There was money, there was competition, and there was a proven engine of sales, which was the royal family. The engine had two settings, adoration and destruction. The technology of the period made both of them cheaper than they had ever been. Long lenses had improved. Foreign picture agencies would sell you a shot of a duchess on a beach in Portugal for a price that any paper could cover with the extra copies it sold. And the legal position, before the Human Rights Act, before the Press Complaints Commission had any teeth, before phone hacking became a crime anybody was prosecuted for, was that there was effectively no privacy law in England worth the name. Into that environment, in 1986, walked a woman who was funny, who did not photograph, like a fashion model, who put on weight during and after 2 pregnancies, and who could be relied upon to do something photographable every single week. The nicknames started in 1988, and they were about her body. The Duchess of Pork, Fergie the Frump, the Duchess of Doolittle. The Sun ran a campaign about her weight that lasted for years. Private Eye had its own line of attack about the spending. Cartoonists drew her with a snout. This was not a few unkind columns. This was a sustained daily assault on a woman in her late 20s who had 2 babies, conducted by publications selling millions of copies, and the thing that made it work was that everybody agreed it was fair game because she had brought it on herself by being visible. She had, of course, done things. That is the part that makes this a genuine story rather than a simple case of a woman being bullied. Budgie the Little Helicopter was published in 1989, a series of children's books about an anthropomorphic helicopter, and it was commercially successful, and it was immediately followed by allegations that the concept was lifted from an earlier character. The claims were denied and never established, but they ran for months. She took free holidays from wealthy people who wanted the association. She flew places at public expense, and the trips did not always survive scrutiny. She was appallingly bad with money, in a way that was already visible before the marriage was in trouble. But hold 2 things next to each other. In those same years, Prince Charles was spending public and duchy money on a scale that dwarfed anything she ever did, and Princess Margaret had been living a life on mystique that would have finished any of them if it had been reported the way Sarah was reported, and Prince Philip had been the subject of persistent rumors for decades that the papers simply did not print. The difference was not the conduct. The difference was that those people were born into the family, and Sarah Ferguson had married into it, and the institution's protection is allocated by blood, and it always has been. That is not a theory I am imposing on the material. It is a pattern you can see running through the whole century. Wallis Simpson was destroyed, and Edward VIII was exiled with a title and an income. Peter Townsend was posted to Brussels, and Princess Margaret stayed. Marion Crawford, who had raised 2 future queens, published one affectionate book and was never spoken to again by anybody in that family for the remaining 38 years of her life. The institution absorbs its own, it expels everybody else, and the expulsion is always presented as the natural consequence of the expelled person's behavior. By 1990, the character called Fergie existed in the public imagination as a fully formed thing. Greedy, loud, common, sponging, fat. That character was assembled out of real raw material, which is what made it so hard to fight, and the woman it was attached to had no institutional apparatus behind her capable of fighting it, and would not have known how to instruct such an apparatus if she had. She has said since that she read the papers every day in those years, all of them. She has described going through them in the morning, alone, the same way you would pick at a wound. Whatever else she was not insulated. Diana was doing exactly the same thing in Kensington Palace, and the 2 of them talked about it constantly. 2 young women in the same institution, both isolated, both being written about daily, both married to men who were not present in the way they needed, comparing notes on an experience nobody else in the country was having. That friendship is the closest thing to support either of them had, and the institution regarded it, correctly, as dangerous. Two of them together were harder to manage than either alone. They encouraged each other. Diana's confidence in the early 90s has been traced by more than one biographer directly to Sarah's example, and the traffic ran both ways. By 1990, the York marriage was effectively finished, and almost nobody outside a very small circle knew it. The house is a good place to see the collapse, because the house was supposed to be the fix. Sunninghill Park was a wedding present from the Queen, built on Crown Estate land near Windsor, finished in 1990, and it cost something in the region of £5 million of public money, which is the figure that was reported at the time, and which the palace never seriously disputed. It was large, modern, low, and built to a design the couple had a substantial hand in. The press looked at the photographs, noticed the resemblance to the ranch house in a popular American television series about Texan oil money, and named it South York. And the name stuck so completely that people who cannot tell you a single other fact about Sarah Ferguson can tell you that one. They moved in. Within a year, the marriage was over in everything but the announcement. The house that was meant to be a home for a couple who were never in the same country became a house one of them lived in alone, with two small children, while the other one was at sea, and then, increasingly, a house neither of them wanted to be in. What went wrong between them is less mysterious than the tabloids made it. They had married after a courtship of a few months, conducted mostly at weekends, on the strength of genuine attraction and genuine affection, and a shared sense of humor that everybody who knew them both attests to. Then he went away for 5 years. She was left in an institution she did not understand, being attacked daily without him. And when he came back as the man that institution had made, someone who had never in his life been required to accommodate another person's needs, and who could not understand why she was not simply getting on with it. Neither of them was a monster in the marriage. That is my honest reading of the available material, and it is also, revealingly, hers. In 4 decades of talking about him, including years when it would have been extremely profitable to do otherwise, Sarah Ferguson has never once said a genuinely damaging word about Andrew as a husband. She has criticized herself constantly. About him, she has been relentlessly, sometimes absurdly, loyal. The end came in stages through 1991 and into 1992, and the public trigger was a Texan. Steve Wyatt was the stepson of an oilman, well-connected in Houston, personable, in London a good deal, and part of the circle of wealthy international men who attached themselves to the Duchess of York in this period, offering hospitality, flights, houses, holidays. Whether the friendship was an affair has never been established, and both parties denied it. What is not in dispute is that in January 1992, a set of photographs of Sarah and Wyatt on holiday in Morocco, with Beatrice present, was found by a cleaner in an empty flat in Cadogan Square, sold and published. Consider the position from the palace's side. A senior royal marriage, already known internally to be dead, is now the subject of published photographs of the Duchess on holiday with another man. The Queen's advisors had spent 5 years watching this woman generate one crisis after another, with no evidence of learning. And Andrew, who was still at sea for much of the year, was the Queen's second son, and the family had every intention of keeping him. The separation was announced from Buckingham Palace on the 19th of March 1992. The statement was correct and brief, and gave no reasons. And then something happened that almost never happens, which is that the machinery malfunctioned in public and left a record. The Queen's press secretary at the time was a man named Charles Anson. Anson was a career diplomat before he took the job, well regarded, not a wild man. On the day of the announcement he spoke to Paul Reynolds, who was then the BBC's royal correspondent, and in that conversation he said things about the Duchess of York that went considerably beyond the official statement. The substance was that her behavior had been unsuitable, that she was unsuitable for royal life, and that the fault lay with her. Reynolds reported it, not as an unnamed source, because the whole convention of the unnamed source is that everybody agrees to keep the machinery invisible, but as what it was, which was the Queen's own press secretary briefing against her son's wife on the day the separation was announced. The palace could not hold that position. Anson apologized. He wrote to Sarah Ferguson and apologized, and the apology was made public, and he continued in the job. I have spent a lot of this video describing a method that leaves no evidence. That is the exception. That is the day the method was visible, in the open, attributable to a named official, and confirmed by an apology in writing. Everything I have said about the anonymous quote and the withdrawal of protection you are entitled to treat as inference. This one you do not have to take on trust. And there is a detail in it that matters more than the incident itself. Anson was not freelancing out of personal dislike. Press secretaries do not brief against the Queen's daughter-in-law on a whim on the morning of a formal announcement. He was doing what that office had been doing quietly for decades. The only unusual thing was that he did it to a journalist who declined to play the game by the usual rules. That office has a history worth knowing, because it explains the reflex. For most of the 20th century, the palace press operation was run on a principle of total silence. Richard Colville, who held the post from 1947 to 1968, was known in Fleet Street as the abominable no-man, and his method was to refuse to comment on anything, ever, on the theory that the family's mystique depended on the absence of information. That worked as long as the papers were deferential. By the 1980s, the papers had stopped being deferential, and the silence no longer functioned as a defense, so the operation adapted. It could not attack a newspaper, it could not sue, in most cases, and would not have wanted the disclosure. What it could do was guide. It could indicate, off the record, which stories were true, which were being taken seriously inside the palace, and which individuals were regarded internally as the problem. That guidance shaped months of coverage without ever appearing in it. And it operated on a strict hierarchy. When the story concerned a born member of the family, the guidance was protective. When it concerned somebody who had married in and was on the way out, the guidance was corroborative. Journalists of that period have described the difference in exactly those terms. You could feel the temperature change on a particular name, and you would know, without being told, that the person had been written off. Sarah Ferguson had been written off by 1990 at the latest. The photographs from Cadogan Square did not cause that. They gave it a date. She left Sunninghill in the spring of 1992 and rented a house nearby, and the arrangement immediately became something the British press could not process, because she and Andrew remained on good terms. He visited, they had lunch, they took the children out together. In an era when a royal separation was supposed to look like a war, the Yorks looked like two people who liked each other and could not live together, which was in fact exactly what they were. And then came August. The financial advisor was John Bryan. He was American, a friend of Steve Wyatt, and after the separation he took on the management of Sarah's affairs, which by that point were in serious disorder. In the second week of August 1992, she was at a villa near Saint-Tropez, with the children and with Bryan. A photographer named Daniel Angeli, working from a distance with a long lens, took several hundred frames over a period of days. The Daily Mirror got them and ran them on the 20th of August, over multiple pages, and the most famous of them showed her lying beside a pool, topless, with Bryan holding her foot and his mouth to her toes. The photographs also showed her daughters in the background, which is what the paper's critics fastened on, and which is the part that has aged worst. She was at Balmoral when it broke. That fact, which she could not have engineered, and which no novelist would dare invent, is what gave the story its permanent power. The Duchess of York was staying with the Queen, in the Queen's Scottish house, in the middle of the family's August holiday, on the morning that a national newspaper published photographs of her topless with a man who was not the Queen's son. The breakfast room accounts vary, as I said at the top. What is consistent across all of them is the silence. Nobody made a scene. She has said the Queen spoke to her later that day, in private, and that what was communicated was disappointment and the necessity of her leaving. She left. She has described driving herself away, along the road out of the estate, with the children in the car, past the police at the gate, and she has said that she cried the whole way, and that at some point on that drive, she understood that she was never coming back, not in the way she had been there before. She was 32 years old. 4 days later, on the 24th of August, The Sun published a transcript of a recorded telephone conversation between the Princess of Wales and a man named James Gilby, in which he called her Squidgy repeatedly, and a national newspaper set up a premium telephone line so that readers could ring in and listen to a private call between the future Queen of England and a car dealer. 2 royal marriages, both destroyed in public, in the same month, by the same industry. The comparison is instructive, and it does not run the way you might expect. Diana survived that summer with her public standing intact, and eventually enhanced, and Sarah did not. And the difference was not that Diana was better behaved. The difference was that Diana had understood something Sarah never did, which was that the press was a weapon that could be picked up and aimed, rather than simply endured. Diana had cooperated with Andrew Morton on a book published 2 months earlier. She had a strategy. Sarah had no strategy at all. She had only a personality, and it had been turned into a weapon and pointed back at her. By November, when a fire that began with a spotlight against a curtain in the private chapel burned for 15 hours and destroyed more than 100 rooms at Windsor Castle, and the government suggested the taxpayer should pay for the repairs, and the country said no, the family's year had become a national joke. The Queen, at the Guildhall on the 24th of November, marking 40 years on the throne, said that the year was not one on which she would look back with undiluted pleasure, and used a Latin phrase for it that translates as horrible year, and the phrase ran on every front page in the country. 9 days later, the Prime Minister announced in the Commons that the Prince and Princess of Wales were separating. The 4 years between the separation and the divorce are the years nobody covers, and they are the years in which the outcome was actually decided. She was not thrown out in August 1992, that is the popular version, and it is wrong. She remained the Duchess of York, still technically a member of the royal family, still living at Sunninghill for part of that period, still the mother of 2 princesses who were 5th and 6th in line to the throne. What changed was the temperature, and the temperature changed in 100 small ways that no single newspaper report ever captured, because no single one of them was a story. Invitations stopped arriving, not all of them, and never with an explanation. The Christmas gathering at Sandringham, which is the family's central annual ritual and the clearest possible signal of who is in and who is out, became complicated and then impossible. Attendance at the events where the family appears together on a balcony or in a church porch was quietly reorganized so that she was not in the frame. Her name came off lists. Requests for her presence at charity events, which had once come in at a rate she could not meet, thinned out, because the organizations making them had learned to check first whether she was still a person the palace was comfortable with, and the answer they got back, in the careful language of such inquiries, was that it might be better to invite somebody else. None of that requires a decision. That is what people miss about how institutions punish. There is no meeting at which it is resolved that the Duchess of York shall be frozen out. There is 100 people who each independently work out which way the wind is blowing, and adjust, and the aggregate of those 100 small adjustments is an exile, and nobody involved has done anything they would recognize as cruel. Meanwhile, the money problem, which had been serious for years, became critical. Here is the arithmetic that governs the rest of her life. She had no independent wealth. Her family were comfortable, not rich. During the marriage, she had lived at a standard set by a household that was not paying its own bills in any ordinary sense, and had spent accordingly and beyond. And by the separation, she was carrying debts that were later reported at somewhere between £3 and £4 million, with figures around 4.2 million appearing most often in the coverage of the divorce. She could not earn in the ordinary way, because a member of the royal family, even a separated one, could not take a job. She could not simply retrench, because she had 2 young daughters whose position required a certain kind of life, and who came with security requirements she did not control. And every avenue that was open to her, the endorsement, the book, the appearance fee, the paid interview, involved converting her royal position into cash, which was the precise thing the institution regarded as unforgivable, and which was also the only asset she had. That is the trap, and it is worth sitting in it for a second before we get to the part where she does the indefensible thing. The institution takes a woman, removes her capacity to earn, provides her with a standard of living, then withdraws, leaving her with the standard of living, the debts, the public visibility, the security exposure, and no permitted means of paying for any of it. Then it disapproves of the means she finds. If you want to know whether that is a fair reading, look at what happened to every other woman it happened to. Wallis Simpson lived on her husband's money in France. Princess Margaret had the civil list and a sister. Diana negotiated a lump sum of around £17 million in her divorce, and had the Spencer family and Althorpe behind her, and even she took to accepting flights and holidays from wealthy men, and was criticised for it. Sarah Ferguson had none of those cushions, and she had the worst spending habits of any of them. The divorce came through on the 30th of May, 1996. The financial settlement was reported at around £350,000 for her, with a trust of around £1.4 million for the two girls, and I flag those figures as reported rather than certain, because the terms were private, and the numbers in circulation come from journalists rather than documents. Whatever the exact figure, everybody who has looked at it agrees on the shape. It was a fraction of what Diana received 2 months later, and it was not enough to clear what she owed. And she lost the style Her Royal Highness. That sounds like heraldic trivia, and it is not. In that family, the styles are the operating system. They determine who curtsies to whom, who is addressed how, who goes through a door first, who is family, and who is a guest. Diana lost it too, in the same period, and it was reported at the time that the Queen had wanted both women to keep it, and that the pressure to remove it came from elsewhere within the family and the household. That report has never been confirmed, and I put it to you as contested. What is not contested is the effect. Two women who had been at the center of the family for a decade and a half became, overnight, private individuals who were required to curtsy to their own children. The exclusion that followed was total, and it lasted for a quarter of a century. She was not at the wedding of the Prince of Wales and the Duchess of Cornwall in 2005. The wedding of Prince William in 2011 was attended by a substantial number of people whose connection to the couple was considerably more remote than that of the mother of the groom's first cousins, and she was not one of them. No invitation came for the Diamond Jubilee lunch in 2012. For years there was no place at Sandringham at Christmas. She was, in the language everybody used and nobody wrote down, not somebody the family could be photographed with. And in September 1997, she was not at Diana's funeral. That absence deserves proper treatment because it is the cruelest single item in the list, and because the reason for it is not the one people assume. The two women had been estranged at the time of the crash. The estrangement was around a year old, and its cause was petty in the way that ruptures between close friends usually are. Sarah had published a memoir in 1996, which included an anecdote involving a pair of borrowed shoes and a foot complaint, and Diana, whose tolerance for being written about by people she trusted had been exhausted by then, had cut her off completely. They had not spoken. Then Diana died, and Sarah Ferguson was the woman who had been her closest friend for a decade, who had gone through the identical machine at the identical time, who was the only other person alive who knew what those years had been from the inside, and she was not on the list for Westminster Abbey, and she watched it on television. She has talked about this more than once, and it is the only subject on which the relentless brightness she performs about everything else reliably fails. She has said she never got to apologize. That is a thing you carry for the rest of your life, and it is not something the institution did to her, exactly. But the institution had made the invitation list, and the institution had decided years earlier which category she was in, and when the moment came, the category held. If you are still here, you are the reason this channel exists, and it would genuinely help if you subscribed and turned notifications on, because the videos that go deep like this one only work if enough people stay to the end. Tell me in the comments whether you think the family had a choice about any of this, because that is the argument I keep having with myself. What she did next is the part that has to be told without flinching, because a defense of Sarah Ferguson that skips it is worthless. She went to work. In 1997, she signed with an American weight loss company as their spokeswoman, and the contract was reported to be worth a very large sum, and she was good at it. That is not a joke at her expense. She had been mocked for her body on the front pages of British newspapers for the better part of a decade, and she took that specific injury and sold it in America for money, and the American public, which had never had a stake in her humiliation, found her funny and warm and completely charming. That was the pattern of the next 15 years. In the United States, she was a success. In Britain, she was a punchline. She wrote children's books and appeared on daytime television and did the American talk show circuit, and she was excellent at all of it, because the qualities that made her a disaster inside an institution built on distance are precisely the qualities that make somebody good on a sofa in front of a live audience. And she still could not stay solvent. That is the part that defeats explanation. Money came in at a scale that should have settled everything, and it went out faster. There were ventures. There was a series of business ideas, some sensible and some not, and partnerships with people whose interest in her was not friendship. Her father died in 2003, himself the subject of a scandal in 1988 involving a London massage club, himself in financial difficulty by the end. The pattern in that family was not new. And then, in May 2010, she sat down in a hotel suite in London with a man she believed to be a wealthy businessman. He was Mazhar Mahmood, an investigative reporter for the News of the World, working the technique that had made his career. There were cameras. He was offering money for access to Prince Andrew, who was at that time the United Kingdom's Special Representative for International Trade and Investment, an unpaid government role that gave him meetings with heads of state and business figures around the world. She named a price of £500,000. She accepted a cash payment on the day, reported variously at around £40,000 and sometimes as 50. She said, on camera, that the money would open doors, and she was specific about what she was selling, which was her former husband and the position the British government had given him. The tape ran on the 23rd of May 2010. There is no defense of it. She has never offered one. She said at the time that she was devastated and ashamed, and that financial difficulty was no excuse, which is exactly right on both counts. And she has repeated some version of that for 15 years since. What I would ask you to hold alongside it is this. Prince Andrew's own conduct in that same trade role was already, by 2010, the subject of serious questions in the British press and in diplomatic cables. He was reported to be meeting people whose interests were opaque. He had already been photographed in December 2010, walking through Central Park with Jeffrey Epstein, who had been convicted in Florida in 2008 of soliciting prostitution from a minor and had served his sentence. Sarah Ferguson was caught selling access to Andrew in a hotel room by a reporter with a hidden camera. Andrew was giving that access to people directly, without any middleman, for years. One of those two people was finished by 2010. It was not the one whose conduct carried the greater consequence, and that is the whole thesis of this video, in a single comparison. There is an arrangement at the center of the last 30 years of this story that the British press treated as a running joke for decades, and that I think is the single strangest fact in modern royal history. They never stopped living together. The divorce was final in 1996. Sunninghill Park was sold eventually, in 2007, to a buyer connected to the Kazakh elite, for around £3 million above the asking price, in a transaction that produced years of questions nobody has fully answered. Andrew moved to Royal Lodge in Windsor Great Park, the house that had been the Queen Mother's, on a long lease with a substantial refurbishment, and Sarah Ferguson moved in with him. Not immediately, and not continuously, and the arrangements shifted over the years. But for most of the period from the late 1990s onward, the divorced Duke and Duchess of York shared a house. They raised their daughters there together. They holidayed together. They appeared at family events as a unit when they were permitted to appear at all. She called him the best man she knew, in public, repeatedly. He supported her financially at various points, when nothing else was coming in. Every couple of years a newspaper would discover this again, and write it up as an eccentric curiosity, the world's happiest divorced couple, and everybody would laugh. I do not think it is funny at all. I think it is two people who were both, in different ways, unfit for ordinary life outside that family, holding on to each other because the alternative was nothing. He had never been alone, and had no capacity for it. She had been trying since the age of 12 to make sure nobody left the room. They had been genuinely fond of each other from the start, and the thing that destroyed the marriage was never dislike. And once the marriage was gone, the fondness was still there with nowhere to go. And it meant that when the scandal finally came, she was in the building. The scandal is Jeffrey Epstein, and I need to lay out the sequence properly, because the popular version compresses 15 years into one interview. Andrew met Epstein sometime in the late 1990s, introduced through Ghislaine Maxwell, who moved in the same London and New York circles, and had known Andrew socially for years. The friendship was real, and it was sustained. Epstein and Maxwell were guests at Windsor and at Sandringham. Andrew stayed at Epstein's properties. The relationship continued after Epstein's conviction in 2008, and in December 2010, Andrew stayed at Epstein's house in Manhattan and was photographed with him in Central Park, which is the photograph everybody has seen. In 2011, that photograph and the surrounding coverage cost him the trade role. He resigned in July of that year. That is the first time the institution moved on him, and it moved slowly, and it moved only when the position had become untenable, rather than when the conduct became known. In the same period, Sarah Ferguson's own connection to Epstein came out. In the aftermath of the News of the World sting, when her finances were at their worst, she had accepted money from Epstein. The amount most often reported is £15,000, given to help clear a debt owed to a former personal assistant. When it emerged, she called it a gigantic error of judgment, said she was deeply regretful, and said she would never have anything to do with him again. That statement is the reason she has been unable to say anything useful about her former husband for the last 15 years. Whatever she knows, whatever she saw in the years when Epstein and Maxwell were coming to Windsor, she cannot testify, because she took his money and said sorry for it in public, and the moment she opens her mouth about Andrew, the first question will be about her own check. I said at the beginning that the institution's method includes making its witnesses unusable. I do not think anybody planned that outcome in her case. I do think it is what happened, and I think it is the reason she is the most informative person alive on this subject, and the least able to inform anybody. In 2015, court filings in the United States named Andrew in allegations made by Virginia Roberts Giuffre, who said that Epstein had trafficked her to him when she was 17. Andrew denied the allegations then, and has denied them consistently since. Buckingham Palace issued denials. The story ran and receded and ran again. Then, in November 2019, he agreed to be interviewed by Emily Maitlis for the BBC programme Newsnight, in a room at Buckingham Palace, on camera, at length, about all of it. The interview is the most consequential hour of television in the recent history of the British monarchy, and it is worth being precise about why it failed, because the usual explanation is that he said foolish things, and that is true, but incomplete. He offered explanations that invited ridicule. He described a visit to a fast food restaurant in Woking. He raised a medical claim about an inability to perspire. He said that staying at the Manhattan house of a convicted sex offender had been a convenient place to stay. He said his association with Epstein had provided him with opportunities to learn. But the reason it was fatal is simpler than any of the individual answers. At no point in the entire interview did he express any concern for the girls and women involved. Maitlis gave him repeated openings. He did not take them. He spoke about the damage to himself for the better part of an hour and could not produce the ordinary human sentence that any adult would produce. And the country watched a man who had been surrounded since birth by people who adjusted to him discover on live television that he had never learned how to do the adjusting himself. That is the man Sarah Ferguson married in 1986. That is what the Assembly produced, and she had watched the Assembly at close range for a decade, in the years before any of it was public, which is the whole claim in the title of this video. Within days he had withdrawn from public duties. In 2022, with the civil case brought by Giuffre proceeding in New York, the Queen removed his military affiliations and royal patronages, and it was announced that he would no longer use the style His Royal Highness in any official capacity. He settled the case in February 2022 for a sum that was never officially disclosed, reported in the range of £12 million, with no admission of liability, and with a statement acknowledging that Giuffre had suffered as an established victim of abuse. Look at that list: withdrawal of institutional defence, removal of the styles, the financial squeeze, since the settlement had to be funded and he had no independent means adequate to it, and then the waiting, while the story sat there and did not go away. Those are the same four instruments, in the same order, that were used on his wife 30 years earlier. The difference is that in her case they were deployed against a woman who had taken free holidays and run up debts and embarrassed the family, and in his case they were deployed eventually, and reluctantly, and years late, against a man facing an allegation of a criminal act against a teenager. The machinery does not calibrate to the seriousness of what you did. It calibrates to how much of a problem you are, and it moves at the speed the institution finds comfortable. Virginia Giuffre died in April 2025, at 41, in Australia. She had spent a decade pressing a case against a man the entire apparatus of a foreign state had been arranged to protect, and she did not live to see the end of it. The events of the last year of this story fall after the point where I can speak with confidence, and I want to be straight with you about that, rather than pretend to a certainty I do not have. My reliable knowledge of the record runs to the spring of 2026. What is reported, and what you should verify against current sources before you take it as settled, is that in October 2025, Andrew announced he would stop using the title Duke of York, and that further material concerning his and Sarah Ferguson's correspondence with Epstein entered the public domain during 2025, and that a number of the charities she worked with ended their association with her as a result. If that is right, then the sequence completed itself in the way this video has been describing. She had, by then, been through 2 cancer diagnoses in successive years, breast cancer in 2023 and a melanoma in 2024, and had talked about both publicly with the same relentless openness she has applied to everything else in her life, and had gone on working, because she has always had to. 33 years after she drove herself out of Balmoral, the machinery that removed her had come round again, and taken the man she left behind, and she was in the house when it happened, and she could not say a word. To see whether any of that is really a pattern, or whether I have simply arranged one story to look like one, it is worth going through the century and checking. Start with the abdication, because everything downstream runs from it. In 1936, a king wanted to marry a twice-divorced American woman, and the establishment refused, and he went. What happened afterwards is the part that matters here. Edward left with a dukedom, a settlement, a house in France, and a wife. Wallis Simpson left with a national reputation as a manipulative adventuress that took 60 years to begin to correct, and was refused the style Her Royal Highness for the rest of her life, and was never received by the family in any real sense, and was the subject of a security and intelligence file that ran for years. 2 people, 1 decision, and the punishment was distributed entirely onto the one who had not been born into it. Note the instrument. Not exile, not denunciation. The withholding of a style. It is the same instrument used on Sarah Ferguson and Diana in 1996, 60 years later, and it works because it is invisible to outsiders and total to insiders. Take Marion Crawford. She was the governess who raised the 2 princesses for 16 years, who was closer to Princess Elizabeth in childhood than anybody outside the immediate family, and who in 1950 published a warm, harmless, almost sugary book about that childhood. There is nothing damaging in it. The offense was the act of publishing it all. She was cut off completely, immediately and permanently by everybody in that family, and she lived another 38 years in Aberdeen without a single further word from any of them. Her grace and favour cottage was taken back. The lesson every member of that household learned from the Crawford affair is not complicated. Whatever you saw, you take it with you. Take Peter Townsend, a distinguished wartime pilot, equerry to the king, in love with Princess Margaret and she with him, and divorced, which was the disqualifying fact. He was posted to Brussels in 1953, out of the way, while the situation was managed. She remained. In 1955, she issued a statement renouncing the marriage, and the family kept the princess and lost the equerry, which is the only arrangement it was ever going to accept. Take Diana. She is the exception that people cite against everything I have said, and she is only a partial exception. She was expelled by exactly the same process, with the same removal of the style, and the same reduction to a private individual with a settlement. The difference is that she had learned to use the press as an instrument rather than suffer it, and so the expulsion did not read as a defeat. She had the Morton book in 1992, and the Panorama interview in 1995, and she took her case directly to the public over the head of the institution, and the public sided with her. That is the only successful counterattack anybody has ever mounted against that family, and the cost of it, in her case, was the loss of her royal protection team and a life in which she was pursued by photographers until the night she died. Take Prince Harry and Meghan in 2020 and after. The instruments are identical, and the language of the complaints is identical, and the fact that half the country regards those complaints as self-indulgent does not make them factually wrong about the mechanism. Anonymous briefing, withdrawal of protection, the absence of correction when false stories run. Whatever you think of the Sussexes, the description they gave of how the household handles an inconvenient in-law matches, almost sentence for sentence, a description given decades earlier by a woman whose father managed Prince Philip's polo and who could not possibly be accused of not understanding the English upper class. Now line up the outcomes. Every single person in that list who was born a Windsor stayed. Edward VIII kept his dukedom. Margaret kept everything. Charles, whose conduct through the 1980s and 90s was at least as damaging to the institution as anything Sarah Ferguson ever did, and who admitted adultery on national television in 1994, became king. Andrew held on for 26 years after the first photograph with Epstein and lost his titles only when the pressure became something the institution could not carry. Every single person in that list who married in or worked there was removed. Wallace, Crawford, Townsend, who was not a spouse but was staff, and staff are in the same category. Diana, Sarah, Meghan. That is the pattern, and it is not subtle once you have seen it. The institution's function is the continuity of a bloodline. Everybody else in the building is infrastructure, and infrastructure is maintained while it is useful and replaced when it fails, and nobody blames a boiler for going wrong, they just take it out. Sarah Ferguson understood this eventually. She has never put it in those terms, because she is not an analytical person, and because she has spent 30 years trying to be let back in, and you do not get let back in by publishing a critique of the system. What she has said, many times and in many forms, is that nobody told her anything. That is the same observation from underneath. And to be fair to the institution, which nobody in this genre ever bothers to be, there is a defense available, and it deserves an airing. It goes like this. The monarchy is not a family business that happens to be famous. It is a constitutional arrangement whose entire utility depends on being trusted, dull and above reproach, and it has survived a very long time by being ruthless about anything that threatens that. Individual feelings are genuinely secondary to institutional survival, and everybody who signs up knows it, or ought to. Sarah Ferguson was not conscripted. She married a prince in front of 500 million people, took the title, took the house, took the standard of living, and then behaved in ways that any competent advisor would have told her were incompatible with the position, repeatedly, over years, without correcting course. When an organization has been damaged by a person that many times, distancing itself is not cruelty, it is management. I think that defense is about 40% right, and I want to be honest about which 40%. It is right that she was not an innocent, and right that the family had genuine cause. No institution is obliged to underwrite a person who keeps setting fire to things, and that the sympathetic version of this story, in which a sunny young woman is destroyed by cold aristocrats for the crime of laughing too loudly, is a fairy story that does not survive contact with the record of what she actually did with money. Where the defense fails is on the induction and on the asymmetry. On the induction, the institution's own position is untenable. If the standards are that exacting, and the consequences of failing them are that severe, and the position cannot be resigned from without permanent disgrace, then the obligation to explain the standards to a 26-year-old before she takes it on is not a nicety. It is the minimum. Nobody did it. Not for her, not for Diana 4 years earlier, not for Meghan 30 years later, and the fact that the same complaint recurs across 3 generations of women from entirely different backgrounds is not a coincidence about the women. On the asymmetry, the defense collapses completely. If the principle really were institutional protection, it would apply to the person causing the most damage, and it never has. It applies to the person with the least protection. That is not a system for defending the crown. It is a system for defending the people at the top of a family, which is a different thing, and the reason it is worth saying out loud is that it is presented as the first. Since the money is doing so much work in this story, it is worth stopping to explain how royal finances actually functioned during the years Sarah Ferguson was inside them. because almost everything the British public believed about her spending rested on a misunderstanding of a system that was deliberately opaque. In the 1980s and 90s, the arrangement was the civil list. Parliament voted an annual sum to the sovereign to cover the official expenses of the monarchy, and out of that, the Queen made payments to other working members of the family for their official duties. There was also the Privy Purse, funded by the Duchy of Lancaster, which was private income for the sovereign. Prince Charles had the Duchy of Cornwall, which was, and is, a very large landed estate, producing a very large private income for whoever is heir. The Queen had personal wealth on top of all of it, in property, art, and investments, at a scale nobody outside a small circle has ever accurately known. The Duke and Duchess of York received a civil list payment for their official work. The sum reported for the Duchess was around £250,000 a year, and out of that came her office, her staff, her clothes for official engagements, her travel where it was not otherwise covered, and everything else the position required her to produce. That is not a salary. It is a budget for running a small public-facing operation, and anybody who has run one will tell you it does not go far. Then, in 1992, in the aftermath of the Windsor fire and the public revolt against the taxpayer paying for the repairs, the whole structure was reformed. The Queen agreed to pay income tax. The civil list was restricted to the sovereign, the Duke of Edinburgh and the Queen Mother, and payments to everybody else were reimbursed by the Queen privately. There was a review body inside the palace with the unglamorous name of the Way Ahead Group, which met to consider what the modern monarchy should look like and how many people it needed to fund, and the answer it kept arriving at, over the following 2 decades, was fewer. Sarah Ferguson was separated by the time that reform took effect, and separated people do not receive civil list money. So the woman who by 1996 owed something over £4 million had, from that year on, an income of exactly nothing from the institution she had served for a decade, a settlement in the low hundreds of thousands, 2 daughters who were princesses of the blood, with the security exposure that implies, and a face that no market in the world would fail to recognize. I go through the mechanics because the phrase everybody used about her was freeloading, and freeloading implies an alternative. There was no alternative. Every route to money that was available to her was a route the institution regarded as vulgar, and the routes it would have considered acceptable, which is to say a private income or a rich second husband, were not on offer. The other thing worth understanding is the household, because when I say the institution, I do not mean the Queen. The permanent apparatus of the British monarchy is a civil service in miniature, and in this period, it was run by a small group of men whose names almost nobody outside royal reporting knows. The private secretary to the sovereign is the most powerful of them, the channel between the monarch and the government, and the effective chief executive of the whole operation. In the years that concern us, that post was held by Sir William Heseltine, and then, from 1990, by Sir Robert Fellowes. Fellowes is worth a paragraph on his own, because his position was extraordinary, and it tells you a great deal about how that world works. He was the son of the land agent at Sandringham. He was married to Jane Spencer, which made him Diana's brother-in-law. And he was, throughout the entire collapse of the Wales marriage and the York marriage, the man responsible for managing both crises on behalf of the Queen. He was simultaneously family and staff, and when the interests of the institution and the interests of his wife's sister diverged, he was required to serve the institution, and he did. Around that post sit the master of the household, the keeper of the Privy Purse, the Lord Chamberlain, the press secretaries, and the private secretaries of the individual royals. Every one of those officials has an interest in the smooth operation of the whole, and none of them has an interest in a duchess who generates a crisis every quarter. These are the people who make the decisions I have been describing, not the Queen, who by every account was personally kind to Sarah Ferguson for years after she had every reason not to be, and who by several accounts continued to see her privately long after the family officially could not. The Queen liked her. That is attested by too many people to dismiss. She reportedly enjoyed her company, found her funny, and kept riding with her. And it made no difference at all to the outcome, which is the most instructive fact in the whole story. A woman who was, in constitutional theory, the source of all authority in the state, could not, or would not, overrule the operational judgment of her own household about who could appear in a photograph. Either she agreed with the judgment, or she accepted that the machine had to be allowed to run, or the affection and the institutional decision simply occupied separate compartments in her mind and never met. Any of the three is possible. All three tell you that in that building, personal warmth is not a currency that buys anything. Sarah Ferguson has said the Queen was the most incredible woman she ever knew and that she loved her. She has also spent 30 years locked out of every room the Queen was in. Both of those are true, and the gap between them is the exact space this whole documentary has been describing. Now the press, because the second half of this story is unintelligible without an account of what happened to the British newspaper industry after it finished with her. The News of the World, the paper that ran the Hotel Suite tape in 2010, was the largest-selling English-language newspaper in the world. It closed 14 months later, in July 2011, in the middle of the phone hacking scandal, when it emerged that its methods had extended to intercepting the voicemail of a murdered schoolgirl. The closure was a business decision by its owners, in the middle of a crisis, and it ended a paper that had been published since 1843. The scandal had begun, years earlier, inside the Royal Beat. The first prosecutions, in 2006, concerned the interception of voicemail belonging to members of the royal household, and the paper's royal editor went to prison for it. What followed was a public inquiry led by Lord Justice Leveson, criminal trials, the abolition of the industry's self-regulator, and the slow, partial exposure of how the tabloid press of the 1980s and 90s had actually obtained its material. Majher Mahmood, the reporter in the Hotel Suite, was himself convicted in 2016 of conspiring to pervert the course of justice over evidence he had given in an unrelated case, and he was sentenced to 15 months. I am not going to pretend that any of that undoes what Sarah Ferguson said on that tape. She said it. The recording is real. She was not entrapped into an opinion she did not hold. She was offered an opportunity, and she took it. But the industry that had spent 25 years constructing a public character called Fergie out of her body, her debts, and her holidays, and that had presented itself throughout as the voice of ordinary decency, judging a woman who had let the country down, turned out to have been running its own operation on methods that put its journalists in the dock. The verdicts it delivered on her were delivered by an institution that could not survive scrutiny of its own conduct. Both institutions in this story, the palace and the press, judged her by standards they did not apply to themselves. That is not a defense of her. It is a description of the court she was tried in. I want to go back and fill in the middle of her life, because I have been running through the crises, and the crises are not the life. Between 1996 and 2010, there are 14 years, and they contain the actual daily existence of a woman in her late 30s and 40s who was famous everywhere, welcome almost nowhere, and responsible for 2 children with a royal position she could not give them and could not take away. She rented. That is the small detail that says the most. For years after the divorce, she lived in rented and borrowed houses, moving when arrangements changed, without a home of her own in the ordinary sense, while her daughters were being brought up as princesses. There was Ramenda Lodge near Windsor in the early years. There were periods in the United States. There were long stays in houses belonging to other people, which is a habit that began as necessity and hardened into a way of living, and which is at the root of most of the criticism of her since. She worked constantly. That gets lost because the work was not respectable in British terms. She was on American television regularly. She fronted a weight loss brand for years, and the campaign was successful enough that the company kept renewing. She wrote and published a great many books, including the children's series and memoirs, and later a run of historical romantic novels that sold better than the sneering coverage of them suggested. She did speaking engagements. She took product endorsements. She made a documentary series in Northern England about diet and poverty that was serious in intent and got mixed reviews and involved her actually living with a family in Hull. Every one of those things was mocked in Britain, and every one of them was an attempt by a woman with no capital and no qualifications to convert the only asset she had into a living, and she was, in strictly commercial terms, quite good at it. The money came in. It went out faster. There is no version of this story in which her financial catastrophe is purely the fault of others, because the earnings across those years were substantial by any normal measure, and she was still, repeatedly, broke. There is a psychological explanation available, and she has offered it herself, more than once, which is that she spends to fill something and gives to be loved, and that she has never been able to say no to a person asking for money, or a person offering a good time. I record it as her account rather than as a finding. It is at least consistent with everything visible on the outside. And through all of it she was raising the daughters, and this is the one area of her life where the verdict is essentially unanimous and essentially positive. Beatrice and Eugenie were brought up in the middle of the loudest royal collapse of the era, with a mother the papers called the Duchess of Pork, and a father who would eventually become the most disgraced member of the family in modern history. Both of them came out of it, by every visible measure, functional, unspoiled, and close to both parents. Both went to university. Both have worked in ordinary jobs, which is a genuine break from the pattern for royal women of their generation and rank. Neither has ever, in public, said a word against either parent, and Beatrice in particular has taken on a quiet institutional role in the years since. Whatever else Sarah Ferguson failed at, that did not fail. She and Andrew agreed on almost nothing about money or public conduct, and they agreed absolutely about the children, and they raised them jointly and in the same house long after the marriage was legally over, and the result speaks for itself. The daughters also became, over time, the mechanism by which their mother got partially back in. It happened slowly and by degrees, in a sequence that is worth tracing, because it shows the institution doing the other thing it does, which is the calibrated readmission. The pattern of it is always the same, a long absence. Then a minor appearance at a family event, with no photographers positioned to make it a story. Then a slightly larger one. Nothing is announced. Nothing is explained. The person is simply present, and the presence is allowed to be reported as a thaw, and if the reporting goes badly, the presence can be discontinued without anybody having to withdraw anything. Eugenie married in 2018 at St. George's Chapel, Windsor, and her mother was there, in a hat, in the front rows, photographed with the Queen. Beatrice married in 2020, in a small ceremony during the pandemic. Sarah began appearing at Royal Ascot again. She attended the Queen's funeral in September 2022, and walked with the family. She was reported to have been at Balmoral with the Queen shortly before her death, and to have been given, at the end, some words that she has described publicly, and that clearly mattered to her more than any of the rest of it. 30 years to get back into the photograph, and the thing to notice is that she was readmitted not by the institution forgiving her, because institutions do not forgive, but by the death and marriage of enough of the people who had made the original judgment, and by her own persistence in simply never going away. She outlasted it. That is the only strategy that has ever worked against that family, and it takes a lifetime. The friendship with Diana needs a chapter of its own, because it is the closest thing in this story to a control experiment. Two women, 4 years apart in age, distantly related, who married two brothers into the same institution within 5 years of each other, and who were subjected to the identical machinery at the identical moment. One of them ended as the most photographed woman on earth and a permanent national grief. The other ended as a punchline. The difference between those two outcomes is the most useful thing in this whole account. They had known each other since childhood, in the loose way that girls from that world know each other. Diana was at Sarah's wedding, obviously. Sarah had been at Diana's 5 years earlier as a guest. When Sarah arrived inside the family in 1986, Diana had been in it for 5 years and was, at that point, already deeply unwell and deeply alone in a marriage she had understood by about the 2nd year was not going to work. For a period of roughly 3 years, they were extremely close, and the closeness was noticed and disapproved of. The two of them together were louder, more mischievous, and considerably harder to control than either separately. There was an incident at Ascot in 1987 involving umbrellas and a friend's backside that made the papers and was regarded inside the household as unbecoming. There were escapades. There was, in the summer of 1986, the widely reported episode in which the two of them dressed as police officers to get into a party for Andrew's stag night, which was harmless, and which was written up as evidence of a decline in standards. More importantly, there was influence. Diana's confidence in that period visibly increased, and more than one biographer has traced it directly to the example of a friend who did not appear to care what the household thought. Sarah, for her part, got from Diana the only reliable information she ever received about how the institution actually worked, because Diana had been in it longer and had been paying attention. They compared notes on the same problems: isolation, absent husbands, the press, the specific experience, which nobody else in the country was having, of opening a newspaper and reading about your own body. And then it cooled, and the cooling has been attributed variously to Diana's discomfort with the level of trouble Sarah attracted, to competitiveness, to the way the press constantly positioned them against each other, and to Diana's general pattern in those years of dropping people abruptly and completely. All of those probably contributed. What is certain is that by 1992, when both marriages collapsed within months of each other, they were no longer functioning as allies. That is a genuine loss, and I think it changed both outcomes. Two women inside that institution making a joint case would have been extremely difficult to manage. Two women managed separately were manageable, and the press was actively invested in keeping them apart, because the rivalry sold better than the friendship. Then, in 1996, The Shoes. Sarah published a memoir which included a passage about having borrowed a pair of Diana's shoes and contracted a foot complaint from them. It was a trivial, affectionate anecdote in a book full of them. Diana, by that point, was in a state about disclosure that made anything of the kind unforgivable, and she cut Sarah off entirely and did not speak to her again. 14 months later she was dead, and the last conversation the two of them had ever had was not a reconciliation. Sarah has said, in more than one interview across the following decades, that Diana had been trying to reach her shortly before the crash, and that she did not know it in time, and I flag that as her account rather than as an established fact, because the sourcing is her memory and nothing else. Whether it is exactly true matters less than what it tells you about how she has carried the thing for 30 years. There is one more thread I want to pick up before we get to the end, which is the question of what she has actually said about all of this over the decades, because the record is larger than people assume, and it is remarkably consistent. She has published two substantial memoirs, one in 1996 and one in 2011, and given hundreds of interviews across 4 decades, in Britain and America and everywhere else, including some in which she was extremely well paid and had every commercial incentive to produce something explosive. Across all of that material, the account she gives has not shifted in any significant way. The account is this: she arrived unprepared and nobody prepared her. She was given no role and she filled the vacuum badly. She spent money she did not have because she has never been able to control that, and she has said so in almost identical language for 30 years. She trusted people she should not have trusted. She loved the Queen and admires Andrew and blames herself for the marriage. And she was, for a period in the early 1990s, in a condition of genuine distress that in her own telling came close to breaking her. You can read that consistency two ways. Either it is the truth, told plainly by somebody with no capacity for strategic dishonesty, or it is a very well-maintained public position by a woman whose living depends on being forgiven. I lean towards the first, for one specific reason: the account has never grown. People who construct a narrative for commercial purposes tend to escalate it as the market demands more, and the royal disclosure market has demanded a great deal more over the last 15 years. Every incentive of the last decade pushed her towards a bigger, angrier, more saleable version. She has not produced one. The story she told in 1996 about the palace is the same story she was telling in 2025, and if anything, the later versions are gentler. The other thing to note is what the household has never said. There has been no significant institutional pushback against her account in 40 years. Nobody from inside has come forward to say that she was in fact carefully briefed, that a private secretary sat her down in 1986 and explained the position, that support was offered and refused. If those things had happened, somebody would have said so during one of the many periods in which it would have been convenient to say so. The silence on that particular point is, I think, the closest the institution has come to conceding it. If the claim in the title is that she saw him up close before anybody else did, then the man himself needs a proper chapter, because the version of Prince Andrew that most people carry around is entirely built from the last 6 years and is therefore useless for understanding the first 50. He was born on the 19th of February, 1960, at Buckingham Palace. The gap matters. His mother had become queen in 1952, when Charles was 3 and Anne was 1, and there had been 10 years between Anne and Andrew, and those 10 years had been consumed by the coronation, the Commonwealth tours, and the beginning of a reign. He was the first child born to a reigning British monarch in over a century. He was, by a very wide margin, the wanted one. The Queen took a longer maternity period with him than she had been able to with the first two, and by every account from the household of that era, including some she made herself, he was the child she got to enjoy. Charles had been born to a young naval officer's wife, who then became a monarch and vanished into the job. Andrew was born to a woman of 33 who had the job under control. His grandmother felt the same. The Queen Mother, who found Charles too sensitive and had a complicated relationship with Anne, regarded Andrew as the pick of them, and said so in a way that got repeated around the household for years. Between a doting mother and an adoring grandmother, and a father who preferred a boy who was physical and unbookish over one who was neither, the second son occupied a position no other member of that generation had. And underneath the affection sat the structural fact that everybody in the building bowed to him. Not to Charles, who was the heir and therefore a project, and not to Anne, who was a girl and outside the succession in practical terms. To him, individually, from birth, without any of the burden of expectation that came with being first. He had the deference without the duty. The pattern that produced was visible early, and it stayed visible. Household staff of the period, in the accounts that exist, describe a boy who was charming and cheerful and utterly unaccustomed to accommodating anyone. He went to Heatherdown, then to Gordonstoun, the Scottish school his father had loved and his brother had loathed, and Andrew, unlike Charles, got on there perfectly well, because it rewarded exactly the qualities he had and did not test the ones he lacked. Then the Navy, and the Navy is the part that has to be given its full weight, because it is the one authentic thing. He joined in 1979 and trained as a helicopter pilot. In 1982, when Argentina invaded the Falkland Islands, there was a genuine argument inside the government about whether the Queen's son should go with the task force. The Queen's position, reported at the time, and consistently since, was that he was a serving officer and would serve. He went, on HMS Invincible, flying Sea Kings, and the duties included flying as an exocet decoy, which involved hovering a helicopter in the path of an incoming missile so that the missile would lock onto the aircraft rather than the ship, on the theory that the helicopter could climb out of the way at the last moment. He also flew casualty evacuation and search and rescue, and he was there when the Atlantic conveyor was hit. That is not ceremonial service. It was 6 months of real war, and he came home in September 1982 into a national reception that was, briefly, enormous. The photographs of him on the deck of Invincible, with a rose in his teeth, ran everywhere. He was 22. He was good-looking in the way that photographs of that year still carry, and he had done the thing that no member of his family had done since his father. I want to state clearly that this was earned. Almost everything else in his life was given to him. That was not. The problem, and it is the problem that runs through the following 40 years, is that a man who receives that level of public credit at 22, in a life where every other form of approval has also arrived without being asked for, tends to conclude that the credit is permanent and that it covers everything. The Falklands became, in his own account of himself, the fixed reference point. He returned to it constantly. Decades later, in the interview that finished him, he was still reaching for the language of a serving officer, and the country was watching a man of 59 trying to draw on an account he had last paid into in 1982. Between 1982 and 1986, the tabloids called him Randy Andy and ran a succession of girlfriends across the front pages, and the country enjoyed all of it, and none of it did him any damage whatsoever, and that is worth sitting with for a moment. The identical newspapers that would spend the following decade destroying his wife for her holidays treated his conduct as a national entertainment. He was a prince, behaving like a young man, She was a duchess, behaving like a woman who did not know her place. Same papers, same years. He was, when Sarah Ferguson met him at that Ascot lunch, 25 years old, at the exact peak of his life. War record, uniform, humor, a job he was genuinely competent at, and the unforced confidence of somebody who has never in his existence had to wonder whether a room would make space for him. She married that. It is not difficult to see why. What she then discovered, over the following decade, was the second half of the same character, a man who could not conceive that his convenience might not be the organizing principle of a household, who had never been told no by anybody whose refusal carried consequences, who was, by multiple accounts from people who worked for him across his life, difficult with staff in a specific way, not cruel exactly, but entirely without the reflex of noticing that other people are doing things for him. Staff of the York household in the 80s and 90s, and later staff of his private office, have described the same thing in almost the same words. The demands were not outrageous individually. The complete absence of any sense that they were demands was the thing people remembered. He was also, and she has never disputed this, kind to her personally, funny, and generous in the way that people who have never had to worry about money are generous. Both descriptions are accurate. That is what a person is. The reason all of this belongs in a video about her is that she is the only witness to the transitional version of him. Everybody who describes Andrew now is describing a man post-2019. Everybody who described him before 1986 was describing a war hero in his early 20s. The decade in between, in which the war hero settled into the entitled middle-aged man, happened at close range in front of exactly one adult, and she has never told anybody what she saw. That is the loss at the center of this story, not a scandal that was hidden. A witness who was disqualified before the thing she witnessed became important. Now go back to July 1986 for a moment, because I want to establish what the country was actually like on that day, and why the goodwill was as enormous as it was. Britain in 1986 was not a happy place. The miners' strike had ended the previous year, after 12 months that had torn communities apart. Unemployment was above 3 million. The industrial north and the Welsh valleys were in the middle of a collapse that has not fully reversed 40 years later. There had been riots in London and Birmingham the previous autumn. In April, Chernobyl had put a radioactive cloud over northern Europe and sheep restrictions over Welsh hill farms that lasted for years. Into that, in July, came a wedding at Westminster Abbey with a young woman with red hair who could not stop grinning. The royal wedding of the 1980s had a specific national function, which was to be the day when the country agreed to feel good in unison, and there had been one 5 years earlier, and it had been the most watched television event in British history. This one was smaller, because a second son is not an heir, and it was also, in tone, a great deal warmer, because the bride was visibly enjoying herself in a way the bride of 1981 had not quite been able to manage. The train on the dress was 17.5 feet long. There were bees and thistles in the embroidery for the Ferguson arms, anchors for the navy, and the initials of the couple worked into the beading. She wore a floral headdress on the way in, and it was replaced with a diamond tiara during the signing of the register, which was a piece of theatre nobody had seen before, and which the crowd loved. Prince Edward and Prince William were in the wedding party, William as a 4-year-old page in a sailor suit, misbehaving throughout, in a manner that made every front page. The crowds along the route were estimated at over 100,000. The global audience, as I said, at something around 500 million, which is a soft figure, but the right order of magnitude. Street parties, souvenir mugs, every newspaper in the country in a state of collective delight. And the thing to hold in your mind, when you get to the photographs from Saint-Tropez 6 years later, is that the entire apparatus that produced those photographs and sold them and mocked the woman in them had spent that July morning telling the country that she was the best thing that had happened to the royal family in a generation. Nothing about her changed in between. The market changed. There is a word that keeps recurring in this story, and I have been using it without examining it, and it is time to examine it, because it turns out to be the thread that ties every part of this together. Proximity. Major Ronald Ferguson made his entire career out of being near the royal family without being of it. He was the polo manager. He knew everybody. He was useful. He was in the tent, and the value of his position derived entirely from the distance between himself and the people at the center being small but real. That was the family trade before Sarah was born. His daughter married into the center, which looked like an escape from the trade and was actually its logical conclusion, and then lost the position and spent 30 years selling what was left of it. Endorsements, appearances, forewords, the hotel suite. The commodity in every case was nearness to the crown. Prince Andrew's career after the Navy was the same commodity, sold at a higher level and with official sanction. The role of Special Representative for International Trade and Investment, which he held from 2001 to 2011, was in its essence an arrangement in which the British state monetized proximity to the royal family in order to help British companies win contracts. That is not a hostile description of the job. That is what the job was. A prince turns up, the foreign minister or the ruling family or the sovereign wealth fund is flattered. Doors open and business follows. The trouble with a role like that is that it has no boundary written into it. If proximity to the crown is a thing of value that the state has authorized you to hand out, then it is very difficult to explain to yourself why handing it out to a wealthy private individual who is offering you hospitality is different in kind. The state was doing the same transaction. It just had a policy reason, and he did not. Jeffrey Epstein was, among other things, a purchaser of proximity on an industrial scale. That is what the entire structure of his social life was for. Scientists, politicians, academics, financiers, a prince. He collected access and then used the collection as the product. And the reason he was able to buy Andrew was that Andrew had been raised in an environment where people wanted to be near him and had never once had to ask what they were paying for and why. And Sarah Ferguson took £15,000 from him. So you have a family trade in proximity, a marriage that was proximity made permanent, a divorce that turned proximity into the only asset she had left, a state role that industrialized proximity, and a predator who bought it. Every catastrophe in this story is the same transaction conducted at a different price. The institution's own position on this is that there is a bright line between the acceptable form and the corrupt form, and that people who cross it have only themselves to blame. I would put it differently. That family has been trading on nearness for 1,000 years. It is the whole product. Honors, patronages, invitations, appointments. The entire apparatus is a system for distributing access and converting it into loyalty and money. The line between that and what Sarah Ferguson did in a hotel room is a line of form, not of kind, and the institution's ability to be shocked at her depends on nobody looking too closely at the business it is in. That is the harshest thing I will say about the palace in this video, and I want to be careful about it, so let me limit the claim. I am not saying she was doing what they do. She was doing a debased, unauthorized, cash version of it. And the debasement matters, and the unauthorized part matters most of all. What I am saying is that the shock was manufactured, and that everybody involved knew exactly what the family's real business was. Which brings us to the two people in this who did not choose any of it. Beatrice and Eugenie are in the strangest position of any royals of their generation. They are the granddaughters of a queen, born fifth and sixth in the line of succession, and they are also the daughters of the two people the institution most needed to get rid of. They have never had public roles, never received public funding as adults, and have spent their entire lives being told by newspapers that they were surplus. The reason is a policy that predates their troubles. From the 1990s, the Way Ahead Group and its successors had concluded that the monarchy had to shrink, that the public would no longer fund a large extended family, and that only the direct line and its immediate support should carry out official duties. Both girls fell outside that line by an accident of birth order. Their father fought this for years, reportedly with some persistence, and reportedly without success, and it is one of the very few things he fought for that was not about himself. So they went and got jobs and married and had children and stayed out of it, and by any reasonable standard came through better than almost anybody else in this account. Beatrice has taken on some quiet institutional work in recent years. Eugenie has done the same. Neither has ever spoken publicly against either parent, and both have been photographed with both parents throughout every phase of the disgrace. Whatever verdict you arrive at about Sarah Ferguson, you have to put those two in the scale, because they are the only thing she made that the institution did not take back. Before the verdict, one more period deserves proper attention, because it is the one that most directly answers the question in the title, and it is the years from about 2000 to 2019, when she was living in the same house as the man the world had not yet turned on. Royal Lodge is a large house in Windsor Great Park, with about 30 rooms and a garden of some 98 acres. It had been the Queen Mother's country home for around half a century. After her death in 2002, Andrew took a lease on it, reported to run for 75 years, and paid a sum for the lease, and a much larger sum for refurbishment, and moved in. That house is the physical location of everything that followed. It is where the family reassembled, in its odd post-divorce configuration, with the daughters going between rooms, and both parents in residence, and no husband or wife anywhere in the arrangement. It is where the entertaining was done. And it became, in 2019 and after, the single most contested piece of real estate in Britain, because a man with no public role and no public funding was living in a large house on Crown land, and every discussion of what should happen to him ran aground on the terms of the lease. For nearly 2 decades before any of that, she was in the building. I want to be careful here, because this is exactly the point at which the format I am working in usually starts inventing. The temptation is obvious. Put her in a room. Give her a look across a dinner table. Have a footman remember something. I am not going to do that, and you should be suspicious of any documentary that does, because there is no source for it, and there never has been. What can be said is what is on the record. Ghislaine Maxwell had been part of Andrew's social circle since the 1990s. Epstein visited Britain and was, on more than one occasion, a guest at royal properties, including Sandringham and Windsor, in the years before his 2008 conviction. Maxwell attended Beatrice's 18th birthday party at Windsor Castle in 2006. Sarah Ferguson knew Maxwell socially. All of that is documented, and none of it is disputed. What is not on the record, anywhere, is what Sarah Ferguson observed or thought about any of it at the time, because she has never said, and nobody has ever produced a witness who can say for her. That absence is the honest endpoint of this story, and I would rather leave it as an absence than fill it with something invented. She was there, she has not talked. The reason she has not talked is partly loyalty, which she has demonstrated to a degree that has cost her repeatedly, and partly the £15,000, which means that the moment she speaks, the conversation becomes about her. What we do know is what she did after the 2019 interview, which is that she stayed. When his public life ended, and the honorary appointments went, and the patronages went, and the friends went, the person still in the house was his former wife. She defended him in public. She continued to describe him in the same terms she had used for 30 years. When further material about her own correspondence with Epstein surfaced, and the organizations she worked with cut her loose, she absorbed that too. There is a reading of that which is unflattering, and it is that she stayed because she had nowhere else to go, and no income independent of the arrangement. I think that reading is probably part of the truth. There is a second reading, which is that a woman whose defining wound is people leaving, decided at 12 years old that she would never be the one who left, and has organized her entire adult life around not being that person, at enormous cost, including to her own reputation. Both readings can be true at once, and I think they are. Which brings me to the part of this that I find hardest to be fair about, and I am going to try. Because the whole value of 2.5 hours is that we can afford to do the thing a shorter treatment cannot, which is to put both cases properly and then decide. The case against Sarah Ferguson is not the tabloid case. The tabloid case was about her weight and her laugh, and it was contemptible. The real case is much narrower and much more damaging. She monetized proximity to the Crown for 30 years, and she did it knowing that the ability to do it depended entirely on a marriage that had ended in 1996, and she did it after being told, and after apologizing, and then she did it again. The hotel suite in 2010 was not a first offense. It was the culmination of a long pattern of trading access, gifts, and endorsements, some of it legal and shabby, and some of it worse. She took money from Jeffrey Epstein in the same period that Epstein was a convicted sex offender, and a man whose relationship with her former husband was already a live public question. The sum was small, the judgment was not. She was, over decades, financially reckless, in a way that repeatedly put her family in the hands of men whose interest in her was transactional, and she never learned. Not after Wyatt, not after Brian, and not after the sting. The single consistent trait across her adult life is the inability to distinguish between a friend and a person buying something, and the cost of that failure was borne by her daughters and by an institution she had voluntarily joined. And she has, throughout, presented herself as a person things happen to. The word she reaches for is always some version of naive. A woman in her 60s who has been at the center of international scandal 5 separate times is not naive. At some point, the repeated failure to learn stops being innocence and becomes a choice about which lessons to take in. And I think the honest verdict is that Sarah Ferguson has spent 40 years choosing not to understand things that would have required her to change. That is the case against, and I think it is largely sound. The case for her has to be made on different ground, because it cannot be made by disputing any of that. Start with what she was actually asked to do. In 1986, a 26-year-old woman with a secretarial training and a job in publishing was required, within a period of about 4 months, to stop working, leave her flat, move into a palace, acquire a household, learn a code of behavior nobody wrote down, and become a public figure photographed daily by an industry in a circulation war, while her husband was at sea for 11 months of the year. She was given no preparation and no brief, only a title that carried the weight of 2 centuries and no instruction as to what to do with it. Every criticism of her conduct after that has to reckon with the fact that the same institution has never once, in 100 years, successfully inducted an outsider into that role. Not one. Every woman who has married into the senior royal family since the 1920s has either been the daughter of an aristocrat who already knew the rules by osmosis, or has ended up in some version of the same crisis. The Duchess of York in 1923, who became Queen Elizabeth the Queen Mother, came from a Scottish earldom and knew exactly what she was walking into, and turned out to be the most institutionally successful royal consort of the century. Diana came from an earldom too, and it was still not enough, because she was 19 and nobody helped her. Sarah came from Hampshire and a polo yard, and it was hopeless from the beginning. Second, look at what she was punished for at the time versus what she was actually guilty of. The campaign that destroyed her public standing ran from 1988 to 1992, and its content was her weight, her clothes, her holidays, and her laugh. The financial misconduct that constitutes the genuine case against her had not happened yet. She was demolished as a public figure years before she did the things she is properly criticized for. She then had to live the rest of her life with the consequences of that demolition, without income, with debts, which produced the conditions in which the later misconduct occurred. I do not think that is a complete excuse. I do think that anybody who wants to argue that the punishment fitted the crime has to explain why the punishment arrived first. Third, the double standard. In the specific years that Sarah Ferguson was being called the Duchess of Pork on the front page of the biggest-selling newspaper in Britain for taking a free holiday, Prince Charles was conducting a long, adulterous relationship that would eventually collapse his marriage and require a national reckoning. Prince Philip's private life had been the subject of persistent rumor for decades, without a line of it appearing. Princess Margaret was living a life on mystique that was funded in a manner nobody was permitted to examine. And Prince Andrew was already, by the late 90s, accepting hospitality from people whose interests were unexamined. Every one of them was protected. She was not. The distinguishing variable was not conduct, it was blood. Fourth, and this is the one that I think actually settles it, look at what she never did. She had the material. She was inside that family for a decade, at the closest possible range, during the years when Diana's marriage was disintegrating, and when Epstein and Maxwell were being entertained at Windsor. She was broke for 30 years and was offered, repeatedly and at escalating prices, the kind of money that would have ended the problem permanently in exchange for the account. Publishers have been circling her for 3 decades. Every reasonable estimate of what a genuinely unguarded memoir would have been worth to her runs into millions. She has never written it. 2 memoirs, both self-flagellating, neither containing anything that damages anybody but her. 4 decades of interviews in which she has criticized herself relentlessly and her former husband almost never. She sold access to him for cash in a hotel room, which is contemptible, and she has never sold him out, which is a different thing, and the distinction matters more than it looks. Compare that to the market rate for royal disclosure in the same period. Compare it to what the industry paid for far less. The woman who has been the most consistently mocked figure in modern British public life for being greedy is the one royal insider of her generation who declined the largest check available to her. That is a fact, and it does not fit the character the press built, which is presumably why nobody mentions it. So where does that leave the verdict? She was not a victim. She made her own worst decisions, and she made most of them twice. She was reckless with money in a way that no amount of context excuses. She trusted people any sensible adult would have seen through, and she took money from a man whose crimes were a matter of public record. Anybody who wants to build a hagiography out of this material is going to have to leave a great deal of it out. And she was also, without question, the person that institution treated worst in the modern era, relative to what she actually did. The women who married into the House of Windsor in the 20th century were required to be perfect, were given nothing to help them be perfect, and were discarded the moment they failed, while the men born into it were carried through conduct of a different order of seriousness for decades. Sarah Ferguson is the clearest single case of that arrangement operating, because her offences were so much smaller than the punishment, and because she is still alive, and still visible, and still, 30 years later, paying. The reason her story matters beyond her own life is the sequence. She went through the machine in 1992. Andrew went through the same machine, with the same instruments, in the same order, starting in 2019. Between those 2 dates, she lived in his house, watching, knowing exactly what each move signified, unable to say anything because of her own record. She saw the cruelty first. That is not a metaphor, and it is not a title writers flourish. She was the earlier case, and the earlier case is always the one nobody takes seriously, because at the time, it looked like a woman who could not control herself getting what she had coming. When it happened again, to a man facing an allegation of a criminal act against a teenager, it looked like justice. The same 4 instruments, deployed 27 years apart, on 2 people whose conduct was not remotely comparable, produced outcomes that were roughly identical, and in the second case, arrived after 2 decades of delay that the first case did not get. The machinery does not know what you did. It only knows what you cost. There is a section of her record that almost never appears in any account of her, which is the work, and leaving it out has always struck me as the single biggest distortion in the popular version. She had real patronages, and she did real things with them. She was closely involved with the Motor Neurone Disease Association for years, at a period when that illness had almost no public profile in Britain and no celebrity willing to be associated with something that offers no recoveries and no happy endings. She worked with Teenage Cancer Trust. She took on hospice work. These are not glamorous appointments, and nobody takes them for the coverage, because there is no coverage. In 1993, in the middle of the worst period of her public life, separated, in debt, being pursued daily, she founded a charity called Children in Crisis. It worked in places where children's institutions had collapsed after the end of communism, in Poland and Romania, and later in Africa and Afghanistan, on education, and on the conditions inside orphanages. She went to those places. She kept going for decades, and she raised a very large amount of money, and the organization ran for over 20 years before merging into a larger body. Almost none of that was reported in Britain in real time, because it did not fit. The character called Fergie was greedy and frivolous, and a woman who spends a week in a Polish institution for disabled children is a difficult fact to place in that story, so the fact was simply not placed anywhere. She also went to Poland and to the former Soviet republics for work on children affected by the Chernobyl disaster, and she made a serious documentary in Britain about diet and childhood obesity in which she lived with a family in the north of England, which was well-intentioned and clumsy in places and treated by most of the press as a joke. I raise all this not to balance the ledger, because it does not balance the ledger. A person can do good work and also sell access to a former husband for cash. Both entries stay on the account. I raise it because the public character that was constructed in the 1980s was constructed by selecting evidence, and once it was built, contradictory evidence stopped being reported at all, and 30 years later, the character is what everybody remembers, and the selection process is invisible. That is how a reputation is actually made and unmade, and the fact that some of the evidence supporting hers was true does not mean the process was fair. The obvious question sitting under all of this is whether it had to be like that, and the way to answer it is to look at the other monarchies, because Britain is not the only country in Europe that has this problem, and it is conspicuously the worst at solving it. In Norway, the Crown Prince married a woman in 2001 who had a child from a previous relationship, a past associated with the party scene, and a former partner with a drug conviction. All of it was public before the wedding. The response of the Norwegian court was to have her address it directly and publicly, once, with the family visibly behind her, and then to integrate her fully. She has been an entirely successful crown princess for a quarter of a century. In the Netherlands, the heir married an Argentine woman in 2002 whose father had been a minister in a military dictatorship. That is a considerably graver difficulty than anything in Sarah Ferguson's life. It was handled by an actual process. Parliament debated it, an academic report was commissioned on the father's role, a decision was taken that he would not attend the wedding, and having taken the pain deliberately and in public, the institution then closed around the woman and defended her completely. She is now the queen. In Spain, the heir married a divorced television journalist. In Denmark, an Australian marketing executive. Every one of those courts did the two things the British court has never done. They dealt with the difficulty openly, at the start, on their own terms, rather than allowing it to be dealt with by newspapers over a decade. And they provided the incoming spouse with actual preparation, in some cases running to months of formal instruction, in constitutional matters, language, protocol, and press handling. None of those monarchies has produced a Sarah Ferguson, or a Diana, or a Meghan. The British one has produced all three inside 40 years. And the common factor is not the women, who have almost nothing in common with one another, and is not the press, because the Dutch and Scandinavian press are not gentle. The common factor is a household that regards preparation as somehow beneath the dignity of the thing, that treats the induction of an outsider as an admission that the position can be learned rather than inherited, and that would rather lose a person every 15 years than concede that. That is the counterfactual, and it is not a fantasy. It is being run successfully by 4 other constitutional monarchies in the same continent, in the same media environment, in the same decades. So what do you do with a life like that? The conventional endings are all available, and all of them are wrong. There is the tabloid ending, in which a greedy woman got what she deserved, and the story is a morality tale about knowing your place. There is the rehabilitation ending, in which a warm and much wronged woman survived a cruel establishment and is finally understood, which is the version she would prefer, and which requires ignoring a hotel room in Mayfair and a check from a convicted sex offender. And there is the ending this genre usually reaches for, in which everybody was a little bit right, and the truth lies somewhere in the middle, which is not an ending at all. The honest one is stranger and less comfortable than any of those. Sarah Ferguson is the only person who has been inside that institution as an adult, been destroyed by it, and then stayed. Everybody else left. Wallace went to France. Cruelty went to Aberdeen and silence. Diana went out into public life and then died. Harry went to California. Sarah was thrown out in 1992 and then simply refused to go anywhere and lived in the same house as the family's second son for the next 20 years and turned up at Ascot and outlasted almost everybody who had made the decision about her. 33 years is a long time to stand at a door that has been closed. And the thing she was standing there watching, for all those years, was the machine that had processed her processing somebody else, the withdrawal of the defense, the unattributable line to a friendly correspondent, the money going quiet, the waiting. She knew what every stage meant, because she had been the earlier draft. And she could not tell anybody, because she had spent her own credibility, some of it in ways that deserve no sympathy at all, and because she is constitutionally incapable of the one act that would have made her rich, and would have made her matter, which is to turn on the people who took everything from her. That refusal is either the best thing about her or the last symptom of the wound she has had since her mother drove away from a Hampshire farmhouse in 1972. I have gone back and forth on it for the length of this video, and I am not going to pretend to have resolved it. What I am certain of is the sequence, because the sequence is the thing that the title of this video points at, and the thing everything here has been assembled to demonstrate. The cruelty was not invented in 2019. It was not a response to an unforgivable scandal, applied reluctantly to a member of the family who had finally done something the institution could not carry. It was a standing capability, maintained for a century, used regularly, and it had already been used at full strength on a 32-year-old woman with 2 small children whose worst offenses at the time were a set of debts and some free holidays. She saw it first. She saw all of it, from close enough to touch, years before the scandal that made the rest of the world see it. That is the whole of the case, and it is why the person best qualified to explain what happened to Prince Andrew is a woman nobody in Britain has been willing to listen to since 1992. If you got this far, thank you. That means more than the numbers do. Subscribe if you have not, because these long ones only work when people stay, and there are more of them coming on the people around this family who never got to give their own account. Tell me in the comments what you think she should do now, whether the book is owed to her or owed by her, because I have been arguing about that with myself for 2.5 hours, and I still do not know. She was 26 when she walked up that aisle, in a dress with a 17-foot train, in front of a country that had decided it adored her, with no idea what she had agreed to. Nobody told her. Nobody has ever told any of them, and every few decades, the same institution stands in the same rooms and does the same thing, and looks, from the outside, entirely blameless.